When you look at the crash report for a highly complex machine, say like a commercial jet engine or the structural collapse of a suspension bridge, there's this ingrained human expectation that the cause of the failure will just naturally match the scale of the disaster.
Right, yeah, it's a natural cognitive bias, really.
Exactly. We subconsciously look for this massive, cascading systemic breakdown, some sort of catastrophic design flaw that was just obvious from the start.
Well, we want the reason for a tragedy to be as monumental as the tragedy itself. I mean, it gives us a false sense of order,
Yeah.
the idea that massive failures only come from massive, easily observable problems.
Yeah, but the reality of forensic engineering tells a completely different story. When investigators actually sift through the wreckage, they rarely find a massive design flaw.
I find an O-ring.
Right. They find a single, tiny, seemingly insignificant variable, like a valve that was subjected to a temperature drop it just wasn't rated for, causing the rubber to turn brittle.
And because the surrounding system wasn't designed to compensate for that one specific environmental shift.
The entire structure violently shakes itself apart in seconds. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're opening a special session we call Control Studies, a show that analyzes how real serial killers actually got caught, what specific operational failures ended their methodology, and what a smarter, more disciplined approach would have looked like.
And just to set the tone, we are keeping this strictly clinical and analytical.
Yeah, absolutely no room here for sensationalism. This is a case study of variables and environments, not a true crime recap.
And framing it that way is crucial for you, the listener, to truly understand the mechanics of evasion. We are going to examine an extended timeline, not through the lens of a terrifying narrative, but as an interplay of operational protocols, geographic advantages, and frankly, administrative blind spots.
You'll see how an environment can accidentally shield a highly active offender for years. And critically, how a single fundamental misunderstanding of physics and environment ultimately guarantees their capture.
So who is the subject of today's case study?
The subject is Robert Napper. We have this really extensive stack of source materials, psychiatric evaluations, police timelines, forensic lab reports, and administrative postmortems. Our mission today is to trace his operational timeline.
Right, to understand how a highly specific geographic methodology provided him with an almost impenetrable shield.
Yeah, and how he inadvertently dismantled his own protection. But to understand the collapse, we really have to start with the foundational blueprint of his psychology. Napper was born on the 25th of February, 1966, in the area, and he grew up in the neighborhood.
And the data from his early childhood establishes a baseline of just profound instability, which is really essential to mapping his later operational patterns.
Yeah, the environmental variables of his formative years were entirely defined by sustained, severe domestic violence.
It's awful. The records show that his father was chronically abusive toward his mother, and Napper, being the eldest of 4 children, was a constant witness to this volatile dynamic.
When we analyze this from a developmental psychology perspective, we have to recognize the immediate neurological impact on a developing brain, right?
Oh, absolutely. A child in a chronically violent home is forced into a state of permanent hypervigilance. The home environment, which, developmentally must serve as a secure, predictable baseline for a child to learn socialization, is completely inverted.
It becomes a theater of unpredictable threat.
Exactly. It's an environment where the fundamental rules of cause and effect just don't apply in any rational way.
And that instability was entirely out of his control. When he was 9 years old, his parents divorced, which formally fractured the family structure.
Right.
But instead of moving to a more stable environment, all 4 children were placed into foster care.
Right.
Furthermore, Napper and his siblings underwent psychiatric treatment for 6 consecutive years at a hospital in South London.
And that 6-year duration, that is a staggering variable. Institutional psychiatric treatment from age 9 to age 15 represents the vast majority of his critical developmental window.
Wow, yeah.
He is spending those formative years largely outside the standard parameters of social conditioning. He isn't learning how to negotiate peer relationships, how to build empathy, or how to function within normal societal boundaries.
Right, and the school records from this period corroborate this completely. He was entirely isolated. His peers described him as someone they actively avoided and despised.
There was no integration.
No peer correction, no social group to act as a buffer. And we have to overlay that environmental isolation with his clinical evaluations. Napper was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and Asperger's syndrome, which we now understand under the broader umbrella of autism spectrum disorder.
And the combination of those two specific clinical diagnoses, interacting with that profound childhood trauma we talked about, creates a highly unique psychological profile.
So,
Well, paranoid schizophrenia introduces a persistent state of internal threat. It fractures the perception of reality, often introducing auditory hallucinations and deep-seated delusions that everyone and everything is hostile. Simultaneously, the autism spectrum disorder, particularly in how it presented in his case, contributed to an intense rigidity of thought. It severely impaired his ability to intuitively read social cues or engage in the unspoken contracts of human interaction.
so he was locked in an internal world that was terrifying, and he lacked the neurological toolkit to connect with the external world for reassurance.
Exactly.
But this is where I want to push back on the timeline a bit because it presents a paradox to me. If we look at the clinical definition of paranoid schizophrenia, it often manifests as highly disorganized behavior.
Right, it does.
So if his internal world is plagued by paranoid delusions, and his external environment is a chaotic cycle of abuse and institutionalization, how does he eventually develop into an offender who uses a highly rigid, disciplined methodology?
That's a great question.
I mean, to use an engineering analogy, how do you build a perfectly calibrated, structured machine using only shattered, unpredictable components? Chaos usually breeds more chaos, not calculated control.
Well, that is exactly the friction point we need to analyze, because the control he developed was not a sign of a healthy, organized mind. It was a desperate, maladaptive trauma response.
Okay.
When an individual feels utterly powerless in a hostile universe, extreme control over a microenvironment becomes a survival mechanism. And the records pinpoint a distinct catalyst that triggered this shift.
What was it?
At the age of 13, Napper suffered a severe sexual assault by a family friend during a camping trip.
A trauma that directly violated his physical autonomy.
Yes. The offender in that case was ultimately prosecuted and imprisoned, but the psychological cascade within Napper was immediate.
Yeah, the assault acted as an organizing principle for his pathology, didn't it?
It did. Following that event, his mother documented a fundamental shift in his behavior. He didn't just withdraw, he underwent an intense inward collapse characterized by obsessive tidiness and reclusive habits.
So he was attempting to exert absolute authority over the only things he could control, his immediate physical space and his possessions.
Exactly. And that desire for control quickly weaponized. He started asserting dominance within the family structure. He became controlling and predatory toward his younger siblings.
He began bullying them, and he engaged in systematic spying on his sister.
What you are seeing there is the prototype of a methodology. He is transitioning from the role of the victim to the role of the aggressor, but he is doing it within a highly controlled, familiar environment.
Right. Bullying his siblings and spying on his sister, these are exercises in surveillance and dominance.
He is testing his ability to hold power over vulnerable targets. He is rehearsing the mechanics of predation.
And this rehearsal phase inevitably scales up. By 1986, when Napper is 20 years old, he has his first documented interaction with the criminal justice system. He is convicted of an offense involving an air gun.
And the choice of weapon is highly indicative of his operational psychology at that time.
Because of the distance.
Exactly. An air gun allows the user to inflict harm and project intimidation from a distance. It requires aim, observation, and detachment. It is a clear escalation from internal domestic bullying to external, legally actionable aggression in the public sphere.
But the internal environment of a house, or even a localized neighborhood, is far too restrictive for the volume of control he was seeking, right? The variables of an enclosed space limit an offender's mobility and trap them in proximity to their actions.
Yes. To truly operationalize his pathology, he required a specific geographic canvas.
He needed an environment that provided inherent passive protection. Which brings us to the operational blueprint of his evasion.
The transition from the static indoor environment to the fluid outdoor environment.
Exactly. From 1989 onwards, a highly systematic series of violent assaults began across southeast London. The geography is the defining variable here. The attacks were centralized along the Green Chain Walk.
And for you listening, to visualize the operational advantages of this specific terrain, the Green Chain Walk is not just a path in a park.
No, not at all.
It is an extensive, interconnected network of public parks, woodlands, and open, green corridors that weave right through the urban density of the region.
It is a fascinating piece of urban planning, honestly, because it creates a paradoxical environment. It is natural and expansive, providing cover and concealment, yet it is heavily trafficked by the public. It is a transient artery running right through residential zones.
And the activity was heavily concentrated in 3 adjacent districts, right?
Yeah, the area encompassing Eltham and Mottingham and the southeast London area. The offender operated exclusively in these open outdoor spaces, targeting women on or near these public walkways. Never indoors, never in a private residence.
And over a 4-year span, investigators ultimately attributed at least 70 attacks within this geographic network to this single individual.
70. Napper himself later confessed to the earliest incidents in this series. 70 attacks in 4 years. If you do the math on that frequency, I mean, it is a staggering volume of operational activity to sustain without triggering an immediate, effective police interdiction.
It really is. To maintain that operational tempo, the methodology has to be incredibly disciplined. He wasn't relying on impulse, he was relying on preparation. We have to look at the mechanics of how he interfaced with that environment.
Physically, he utilized his size. I mean, he was a tall, imposing figure. He employed a knife to secure immediate compliance, bypassing any prolonged struggle that might draw attention. And he transported his weapons and materials in his sports bag.
And that single detail, the sports bag, is a phenomenal piece of urban camouflage.
It is the perfect integration into the transient space. A man walking through a public park with a sports bag signals to the brain that he is engaged in a routine, benign activity. He belongs in that environment.
Right, it suppresses the natural threat response of both his targets and any potential witnesses until he closes the distance.
But the true depth of his methodology was discovered in his administrative preparation. He kept detailed written records, he drafted precise maps, and compiled notes detailing locations of potential and actual attacks all along the green chain grid.
Which completely dismantles the idea that these acts were driven by unpredictable psychotic impulses. Schizophrenia may have fueled his internal reality, but his execution was meticulous.
He surveyed the terrain.
Exactly. He identified choke points, calculated sight lines, mapped out multiple egress routes, and analyzed foot traffic density. He treated the public park system like a military theater of operations.
When I look at the variables of that outdoor environment, it functions perfectly as a self-cleaning crime scene. The physics of a public park naturally degrade forensic evidence.
There are no fixed addresses to tie an offender to a specific location.
Right. There are no walls or ceilings to trap biological transfer. You have the ambient weather, wind dispersing trace fibers, rain washing away biological fluids, UV radiation breaking down cellular structures.
On top of that, you have continuous transient foot traffic, actively destroying footprints and cross-contaminating the scene before investigators even arrive.
The environment itself is constantly erasing the past.
That is the crucial concept here: passive protection. Napper did not invent a way to destroy evidence. He simply operated in an environment that did the work for him. The geography provided a massive buffer against forensic science.
However, we need to be extremely precise about how we analyze this evasion, because when you stack up the maps, the sports bag camouflage, and the sheer volume of 70 undetected attacks, the human brain automatically tries to construct a narrative of a criminal mastermind.
Oh, absolutely. We want to believe he was an evil genius who mathematically calculated every move to outsmart the authorities.
And entertaining that narrative is the quickest way to misunderstand the reality of historical cases. Control studies demands that we look past the myth of the mastermind. Napper did not design an unbreakable system.
No, he survived for years because his passive geographic protection was compounded by 3 distinct, catastrophic, and entirely separate systemic failures within the investigative apparatus. He wasn't outsmarting the system was blinding itself.
So let's systematically break down those administrative failures, because this is where the machinery of the investigation truly comes apart. Failure variable 1, the dismissed KIP.
Oh.
We have to go back to October 1989.
Okay.
Napper's own mother contacts the police. She formally reports that her son has admitted to committing a rape on the local common in the area.
Wow. We have to acknowledge the gravity of that moment. The psychological threshold a parent must cross to implicate their own child in a violent crime is immense. She recognized the pattern of his behavior and provided the authorities with a direct vector to the offender.
Yeah, and following that report, she permanently severed all contact with him. So the intelligence is delivered directly to the police. How does the system process it? The officers look at their active files, review the recent local reports, and conclude that they have no open case matching the description she provided.
So they just dismiss the tip and close the inquiry.
Exactly. But the administrative reality was entirely different. It was later uncovered that a severe assault, the rape of a 30-year-old woman committed in the presence of her children, had been reported exactly 8 weeks prior.
Oh, no.
And the location of that crime was a house backing directly onto the exact common the mother specified.
It is a textbook failure of data synthesis. The concept of signal-to-noise ratio is critical in intelligence gathering. The mother provided a massive high-value signal. But because the 8-week-old report was not properly indexed or perhaps filed in a slightly different geographic subcategory, the system couldn't connect the two pieces of paper.
The suspect is literally handed to them, but the bureaucratic machinery lacks the basic organizational logic to link the perpetrator to the event.
Which flows directly into failure variable 2, the rigid parameter. This is perhaps the most glaring example of how inflexible data management destroys an investigation. During the massive dragnet surrounding the green chain attacks, Napper actually entered the suspect pool. He was examined by investigators.
Like, really? And he was systematically excluded based on a single flawed metric.
Yes. Witness testimony is incredibly complex. Several witnesses who survived attacks in the park described their assailant as being roughly 5'7" tall.
But Robert Napper was 6'2".
Exactly. However, due to his psychological state and perhaps a desire to minimize his profile, he consistently walked with a severe, stooped posture.
Right, and the psychology of eyewitness memory, especially under the duress of a traumatic assault, is notoriously unreliable.
When a person is experiencing an extreme adrenaline dump, often experiencing what we call weapon focus, their brain prioritizes immediate threat assessment over accurate dimensional recording. Depth perception narrows.
So a tall man, hunched over in a dark park, moving aggressively, will register in a traumatized mind as a much smaller, condensed figure.
Exactly. But the detectives didn't treat that height estimate as a fluid variable influenced by trauma. They treated it as an absolute, unyielding mechanical metric. They inputted 5'7" into their parameters and drew a hard binary line.
The strategic decision was made to actively exclude any male over 6 feet tall from the investigation. Napper is 6'2". Therefore, the administrative protocol literally erases him from the board. He isn't slipping through a net. The operators of the net are deliberately throwing him back into the ocean because he doesn't match a flawed mathematical parameter.
It highlights the inherent danger of applying rigid binary logic to the chaotic variables of human perception. If the database says 0 and the reality is 1, the database blinds the user to reality.
And the final layer of this institutional blindness brings us to failure variable 3, information silos.
Okay.
The policing environment of the late 1980s and early 1990s was not the interconnected digital network we expect today. Investigations into the various attacks along the Green Chain Walk were distributed among different local police departments based on municipal boundaries.
Right. The geography of the attacks spanned multiple jurisdictions, but the intelligence gathering did not. This is the classic silo effect. Napper's name, his prior firearms conviction, and various localized reports existed in the archives of one specific department.
But those localized records were essentially trapped in paper filing cabinets. There was no systemic mechanism, no centralized behavioral database to automatically cross-reference his name and flag it for the other departments hunting the exact same geographic profile just a few miles away.
So when you synthesize these three variables, a dismissed high-value tip, a fundamentally flawed physical parameter, and impenetrable intelligence silos, you realize that Napper was operating under a massive, unintended umbrella of administrative protection.
The self-cleaning physics of the outdoor environment erased his physical trace, while the bureaucracy of the police erased his identity.
But as we know in engineering, an O-ring only holds until the environment changes.
Exactly. The green chain methodology provided a remarkably stable equilibrium, but an escalation in pathology, a sudden deviation from the established protocol, was about to test the absolute limits of that protection.
We are tracking a shift from calculated, highly repetitious methodology to a catastrophic loss of operational discipline. The internal pressure of his psychopathology finally overrides his strategic control.
We move to July 15, 1992. The location is Wimbledon Common. The victim is Rachel, a 23-year-old woman taking a morning walk with her 2-year-old son and their dog. Now, from a geographic standpoint, Wimbledon Common is located in southwest London.
So it's significantly removed from his established operational zone in the southeast.
Yeah. However, structurally, it shares the exact same environmental DNA as the Green Chain Walk. It is a sprawling public green space, a transient outdoor environment where a man carrying a sports bag blends seamlessly into the background.
The environmental variables align with his preferred operational theater. It is an open space devoid of fixed addresses, characterized by transient foot traffic.
The environment aligned, but the physical execution of the crime represented a radical departure from his baseline. Napper attacked Rachel in a secluded, wooded area of the common. The level of violence applied was astronomically higher than any of his previous assaults.
It was horrific.
She suffered 49 stab wounds. Her young son, tragically present for the entire duration of the attack, was later discovered by a passerby clinging to her body.
Analyzing the physical reality of that crime scene provides a stark clinical indicator of his escalating mental state. In the green chain assaults, he used the knife primarily as a tool for immediate compliance.
Right, he struck quickly to minimize his exposure time.
But inflicting 49 stab wounds is not an act of controlled evasion. That is an absolute explosion of rage. It is an exertion of extreme, uncontrolled physical force that serves no operational purpose other than the fulfillment of a severe psychological break. He has entirely abandoned his discipline.
It is a massive statistical aberration in his timeline. The sheer brutality of the crime in broad daylight triggered one of the largest, most highly scrutinized manhunts in modern British policing. In the ensuing dragnet, hundreds of individuals were vetted.
And during this process, Napper himself was brought in and questioned by police in connection with a separate series of unsolved attacks on women occurring that same year.
So he is physically sitting in an interview room with detectives. And once again, he walks out. The investigators fail to make any connection between the man sitting across from them and the perpetrator of the Wimbledon Common attack. And the reason he slipped away this time wasn't because of a high parameter or a lost file.
No, it was because the entire machinery of the investigation had succumbed to a psychological trap, a trap we call target fixation.
The focus of the investigation had shifted entirely toward a local man named Colin Stagg.
The pressure on the police to solve the case was immense. In an attempt to generate leads, they brought in a criminal psychologist named Paul Britton to construct an offender profile.
Profiles are designed to be statistical models, right? Theoretical frameworks used to narrow down a vast suspect pool based on behavioral probabilities.
Exactly. But the investigators looked at this profile, looked at Colin Stagg, who lived near the Common and had an unconventional lifestyle, and essentially decided he was a perfect, bespoke match for the theoretical model.
This represents a critical failure in investigative methodology. A psychological profile is a hypothesis. It is not empirical evidence.
But in the vacuum of clear forensic data from the Common, the detectives allowed the profile to become the evidence. They elevated a theory to a fact. Colin Stagg had absolutely zero forensic connection to the physical reality of the crime scene.
Nothing at all.
There was no biological transfer, no material evidence, nothing to legally anchor him to the event.
But the target fixation was so absolute, so ingrained in the operational culture of the task force, that they initiated a deeply controversial covert strategy known as Operation Edsel.
An undercover sting operation designed not to gather physical evidence, but to manufacture a psychological confession.
Exactly. A female undercover police officer was deployed to initiate contact with Stagg. Over the course of several months, she systematically built a fabricated relationship with him.
She leveraged his isolation, consistently introducing dark, violent themes into their correspondence and conversations. She was actively trying to draw out the specific fantasies the profile suggested he must possess.
And the psychology of the operation is deeply flawed because it relies heavily on confirmation bias, doesn't it?
Totally. The undercover officer is pulling specific psychological levers, trying to elicit a specific response. When you manipulate an individual's environment so aggressively, any reaction they have can be interpreted as proof of guilt by a team already convinced of that guilt.
Yet, despite months of this intense psychological pressure, Stagg repeatedly and explicitly denied any involvement in Rachel's death.
But the momentum of target fixation is incredibly difficult to halt.
Yeah. Despite the complete absence of forensic linkage, and despite his consistent denials under covert pressure, Colin Stagg was arrested and formally charged with the murder in 1994. He was incarcerated in a high-security prison for over a year while awaiting trial.
And when the case finally reached the Old Bailey, the presiding judge examined the architecture of Operation Edsel and dismantled it completely.
The judge ruled that the undercover operation amounted to deceptive entrapment, deeming the evidence entirely inadmissible. The prosecution's case collapsed, and Stagg was acquitted.
The collateral damage to Stagg's life was profound. But for the purpose of our control study, the damage to the broader investigation was catastrophic, because for years, every available analytical resource, Every detective hour and every ounce of institutional energy was funneled into proving an innocent man guilty.
They created a massive operational blind spot.
Exactly.
And the most agonizing detail of this entire timeline, the moment that truly highlights the cost of that blind spot, occurs in August 1993. This is more than a year after the murder on Wimbledon Common, right in the middle of the covert Operation Edzo.
What happened?
Police receive a complaint about a man actively spying on a woman. They locate the individual and bring him in for an interview. It is Robert Napper. The officers actually write in their internal reports that he displays strange behavior, and they formally flag him in their notes as a potential sex offender.
Wow. The actual perpetrator of the crime they are spending millions of pounds trying to solve is sitting in their own facility. He is actively demonstrating predatory surveillance behaviors, and the interviewing officers recognize the threat enough to document it.
And nothing happens. There is no follow-up. There is no cross-referencing with the Wimbledon case. The investigative apparatus is so blindingly focused on the ghost they engineered out of a profile that they cannot recognize the physical reality of the offender sitting in their own chair.
Target fixation creates a tunnel vision that filters out any data contradicting the established narrative. The system couldn't process the correct answer because it had already decided on the wrong one.
This cascading series of institutional failures, the Barry tip from his mother, the rigid height parameter, the disconnected intelligence silos, and finally the absolute distraction of the Colin Stagg prosecution, provided Napper with a profound sense of invulnerability.
I'm sure it did. He had executed an escalating campaign of violence across open environments, he had survived massive police scrutiny, and he had literally watched the authorities chase the wrong man.
He likely believed the environment would always protect him. In that fundamental miscalculation, the belief that he controlled the system rather than the environment protecting him led directly to the methodology failure that ended everything.
He abandoned the core variable of his success. He changed his operational environment.
We moved to November 1993. 16 months have passed since the aberration on Wimbledon Common. Napper decides to escalate again. His target is Samantha, a 27-year-old woman, and her daughter, the child, aged 4.
But the location of this attack represents a total deviation from his history. They are not walking through a transient public park. They are inside their private flat in the area.
He crosses the threshold from the outdoor environment to the indoor environment. For 5 years, every single one of his documented attacks took place under the open sky. Now he voluntarily enters a sealed private residence.
This specific pivot is the core of our case study today. This is the exact moment the physics of the crime scene radically invert, and his failure to understand the mechanics of that inversion is what ensures his capture.
The reality of the scene inside that flat was one of extreme physical trauma. Napper stabbed Samantha in the neck and chest. He assaulted and smothered the young child. He then engaged in severe post-mortem mutilation of Samantha's body within the sitting room, and he removed specific anatomical parts from the scene to keep as trophies.
It's horrific.
The sheer visceral intensity of the scene was so overwhelming that the seasoned detective assigned to photograph the evidence required 2 years of leave to recover from the psychological impact.
The psychological disconnect required to commit those acts is staggering, but as analysts, we must focus on the mechanical failure of his execution. We must apply the control studies framework.
Right.
For half a decade, Napper functioned exclusively under the protective canopy of the self-cleaning green chain walk. He entered Samantha's flat and operated with the exact same level of physical interaction as he did in the parks. He believed his rules applied everywhere. That was the fatal flaw.
Let's clearly define the physics of this failure. What is the fundamental operational difference between those two spaces?
The transfer of evidence. An indoor flat is a static, fixed location. It is a sealed box defined by walls, doors, ceilings, and a specific address. In a public park, the environment actively works against the preservation of evidence. Indoors, the environment acts as a time capsule.
Every physical interaction leaves an unalterable trace.
Yes. The fundamental rule of forensic science, Lucard's exchange principle, states that every contact leaves a trace. Indoors, that trace is perfectly preserved. The surfaces of a home, painted wood, glass, countertops, they are completely shielded from wind, rain, and UV degradation. There is no transient foot traffic to obscure the entry and exit paths.
He was arrogant enough to believe that the impunity he experienced outdoors would follow him inside. He spent hours in that flat interacting with a static environment, completely oblivious to the fact that the variables were now entirely hostile to him.
A pattern of operation that thrives in the transient rain will instantly destroy an offender in the static dust of an enclosed room.
And the indoor environment immediately recorded his physical identity. He left a single perfect fingerprint on a surface inside the flat. It wasn't washed away by a storm. It wasn't trampled by a jogger. It sat there, perfectly preserved by the sealed environment, a static biological record waiting for the forensic technicians.
And the beauty of that fingerprint is that it completely bypasses all the administrative noise. It bypasses the rigid height databases, it bypasses the psychological profiles and the target fixation. It is empirical, undeniable biological data.
That single point of friction with the indoor environment led directly to his downfall. In May 1994, the detective heading the case formally arrested Robert Napper. He was charged with the murders of Samantha and the child.
He was finally neutralized, not because a team of profilers deduced his internal motivations, but because he failed to understand the basic physics of a static indoor surface.
It is a profound realization. The outdoor environment he thought he had mastered was, in fact, the only thing shielding his incompetence. The moment he stepped outside of that specific geographic advantage, his protection evaporated instantly. It's a perfect example of how an offender miscalculates their environment, and investigators finally exploit that specific error.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these themes, analyzing historical methodology failures and correcting them, are fictionally explored in the novel title Adam, a psychological thriller available on Amazon Kindle.
Oh, yeah.
But returning to the reality of 1994, the arrest of Napper creates a massive pivot point in the broader timeline. Because while the fingerprint instantly solves the indoor murders, it leaves a massive unresolved shadow hanging over the investigative failures of 1992.
True aberration on Wimbledon Common.
Exactly. Napper is in custody. The indoor environment betrayed him. But what about the outdoor environment that protected him? The trace evidence from the Common was captured, but the technology of the era wasn't capable of reading it. Once the environment finally records the truth, how long does it take for forensic technology to evolve enough to understand the message?
We enter the long tail of forensic science.
Let's map out the post-mortem of the timeline. In October 1995, Napper stands trial at the Old Bailey and is convicted for the murders of Samantha and the child. During this process, he also officially admits to 2 of the early rapes and 2 attempted rapes, firmly connecting himself to the green chain methodology.
And given the extreme pathology demonstrated in the indoor scene, he is designated a severe public danger and ordered to be held indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility.
And while he is secured at Broadmoor, the detective who executed the arrest for the indoor murders begins analyzing the broader patterns. He looks at Napper's geographic proximity, his specific pathology, and the extreme overkill present in the flat, and correctly hypothesizes that Napper is a highly probable candidate for the unsolved murder of Rachel.
Acting on this analysis, detectives formally interview Napper at Broadmoor in December 1995, specifically regarding the events on Wimbledon Common. Napper completely shuts down. He denies any involvement.
And without a confession, the investigation hits an absolute brick wall. We have to remember the context of 1995. The 2 investigations had been completely segregated due to the silo effect. Colin Stagg had recently been acquitted, leaving the original task force in ruins.
To bring charges against a suspect already in high security, the police need unassailable empirical evidence. They need the biology to speak.
But the biological evidence from 1992 was a whisper, and the technology of 1995 simply lacked the amplification necessary to hear it. Let's break down the technical realities of the forensic gap. During the initial processing of the outdoor crime scene on the Common, technicians did manage to recover biological material. They isolated a microscopic trace of male DNA from the victim's clothing.
But we must contextualize the limitations of DNA analysis in the early 1990s. The prevailing technique, restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP, required relatively large, highly intact samples of biological material to generate a reliable profile.
Which they didn't have.
No! The sample recovered from the Common was degraded by the outdoor elements and incredibly small. It was a mixed sample. The technology of 1992 could not sequence it with enough resolution to identify a specific individual.
It was essentially a heavily pixelated photograph. You could use it to determine general shapes, but you couldn't identify a face. The sample was only clear enough to be used as a tool of exclusion.
Which is exactly how it was utilized. It definitively proved who the attacker was not. It excluded Rachel's partner, it excluded her son, and critically, it provided the definitive scientific proof that excluded Colin Stagg. But the resolution simply wasn't high enough to proactively point to Napper.
So the timeline enters a state of suspended animation. Napper is permanently detained at Broadmoor for his failure indoors, while his success outdoors remains officially categorized as unsolved. Years roll by. The millennium turns. It isn't until a full decade later, in 2002, that Scotland Yard authorizes a comprehensive cold case review of the Rachel investigation.
And during that decade, the capabilities of forensic science have undergone an exponential evolution. The lens has become incredibly sharp.
The cold case team brings in specialized forensic scientists to completely reprocess the archived physical evidence from 1992. They're now equipped with highly advanced DNA amplification techniques, specifically polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, combined with short tandem repeat, or STR analysis.
These methodologies did not exist in a viable capacity during the original investigation. PCR technology completely changes the physics of the investigation.
Right, it essentially acts as a molecular photocopier, doesn't it?
Yes. It allows scientists to take a degraded, microscopic trace of DNA and artificially replicate specific genetic markers millions of times over until the sample is large enough to be clearly read. They are taking that pixelated photograph and running it through an advanced enhancement algorithm to reveal the high-definition image hiding underneath.
But this isn't a quick computer scan like you see on television. It is a grueling, highly sensitive process. It requires 18 months of painstaking microscopic laboratory work to isolate the specific markers from the mixed sample without cross-contamination.
And finally, by July 2003, the forensic team achieves a breakthrough.
They successfully extract a distinct, high-resolution male DNA profile from the archived clothing, a profile that does not match any of the innocent individuals previously cleared.
The sample is refined, but more importantly, the infrastructure around the sample has evolved. By 2003, this high-resolution profile can be run against a comprehensive, digitized national DNA database, a centralized system that did not exist in the era of information silos, and a system that now contains the genetic profile of every severe offender in custody,
including the patient residing in Broadmoor Hospital. In 2004, the database algorithm processes the comparison. The system returns a definitive, unassailable match. The microscopic biological trace, miraculously preserved despite the self-cleaning outdoor environment, connects directly to Robert Napper.
The scientific capability finally caught up to the empirical truth the environment had captured 12 years earlier.
However, the bureaucratic momentum required to prosecute a historical failure of this magnitude is incredibly slow. Investigators spent another 2 years meticulously bulletproofing the chain of evidence. Finally, in July 2006, detectives traveled to Broadmoor to formally interview Napper over the course of 2 days.
This time, they aren't relying on psychological pressure. They confront him with the absolute reality of the advanced DNA match. They place the biological math on the table. It is the one variable that his paranoia, his rigidity, and his delusions cannot negotiate with.
On the 20th of November 2007, he is officially charged with Rachel's murder. And ultimately, on the 18th of December 2008, at the Old Bailey, Robert Napper enters a guilty plea to the manslaughter of Rachel on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
The legal system accepts his severe paranoid schizophrenia as the basis for the reduced charge, and his sentence of indefinite detention at Broadmoor Hospital is reaffirmed.
During the sentencing phase, the presiding judge distills the entire complex narrative down to its core reality, describing Napper simply as a very dangerous man.
It took 16 years. A full 16 years elapsed between the operational aberration on Wimbledon Common and the final judicial resolution.
When you step back and view this entire timeline from altitude, you see this incredible, fatal contradiction woven into his methodology. On one hand, he possessed the discipline and the structural rigidity to meticulously survey the green chain walk.
He kept detailed written maps. He understood the advantages of transient spaces and visual camouflage.
Yet, simultaneously, he possessed a profound psychological disconnect. He was careless enough to retain a physical, written archive of his own crimes within his residence, documentation that was ultimately recovered and weaponized against him in court.
He was never the master of his environment that he likely believed himself to be. He was merely a temporary beneficiary of its chaotic variables.
He operated with impunity, primarily because the transient nature of the public parks actively degraded his forensic mistakes, and because the investigative bureaucracy blinded itself through rigid height parameters, disconnected intelligence, and blinding target fixation.
But the absolute second he altered those variables, the moment he stepped out of the protective rain of the open park and crossed the threshold into the static, uncompromising environment of a sealed flat, he was neutralized almost instantly.
Synthesizing the data from this case study brings us back to the foundational premise of control studies. Operational protection in one specific context does absolutely not guarantee protection in another.
The variables always dictate the ultimate outcome. An offender may operate in the margins for years, developing a massive false confidence, believing they have outsmarted the investigative system.
In reality, they're merely existing inside an environmental bubble that happens to naturally shield their specific behavioral output. But the moment their pathology demands escalation, the moment they breach their own established methodology and enter a hostile environment, the physics of evasion fundamentally change.
The new environment will mercilessly record their presence.
It forces us to analyze the silence. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the data we cannot currently see. Consider the sheer luck of Napper's timeline. Consider the dismissed tip from 1989, the binary height exclusion that threw him out of the suspect pool, the massive distraction of the Colin Stagg prosecution.
If Robert Napper had never felt the internal psychological urge to escalate his violence, if he had simply maintained his discipline and never transitioned from the transient outdoor space to the static indoor space of that flat in 1993, would the compounded systemic failures of the era have allowed him to remain a permanent ghost in the historical data?
If he had maintained his operational discipline and stayed outdoors, that single fatal fingerprint would never have existed. The primary catalyst for his capture would have been absent.
Exactly.
It forces us to look at the systems currently in place and ask, how many active, repetitive operational patterns are currently shielded out there right now, simply because the offender hasn't yet stepped into the wrong environment? How many flawed administrative systems, rigid databases, and siloed intelligence networks are currently failing to detect an offender simply because that offender hasn't yet made their one fatal geographic miscalculation?
It all comes back to the O-ring on the machine. You just have to wait for the temperature to drop and the entire structure comes apart.
If you want to explore a fictional take on how these historical blind spots are analyzed and corrected, you can check out the novel titled Adam, available on Amazon Kindle.
We want to thank you for joining us as we analyze the variables, break down the mechanics, and study the operational failures.
Until next time, keep looking at the systems, not just the symptoms. Take care.